You know how I know we're living in an alternate universe? It's because in this timeline, video game adaptations are actually good, while established legendary franchises are actually dog shit. If Netflix came to me and told me they wanted to adapt League of fucking Legends of all things into a show, I'd have asked them to reconsider, because suicide isn't a particularly good way to go out, not even for a streaming and production company. Joke's on me though, because it seems like they might have struck gold with this one. If Netflix's gamble pays off, it might ensnare millions of LoL fans and non-fans alike with its brand new series, Arcane. And I can't believe I'm saying this about a video game adaptation, but you should seriously consider watching it. Why? Well, I'm about to explain why. Now, I should mention before we go on that I know absolutely nothing about League of Legends, other than the fact that it's a spiritual successor to a Warcraft 3 mod, which itself evolved from a custom map from the original StarCraft, and as such, I feel uniquely qualified to critique it objectively without being swayed by any feelings of loyalty or investment in the game. So this show is based on the copy of a throwaway map of the game that went on to make more money than hot water, and it's good? Actually, kinda good? I mean, it's not bad. Despite all the nasty things and jokes I'm about to make at its expense, it's definitely not a bad or mediocre or average or even above average show, dare I say. No, clearly a lot of effort went into making this, and while effort alone doesn't guarantee a good product, as we'll learn in this video, it definitely goes a long way. So let's point out some of the positives, shit on some of the negatives, and then you can decide if the title of this video applies to you, or if it ended up just being clickbait. First off, let's start with the intro. The very first few frames, the cold open, before any credits or exposition or dialogue roll in, we get one of the most effective intros I've seen in years. Now, I'm a pretty soulless meat sack. I don't empathize or emote that easily, but I did find myself getting emotional once throughout the season, and it was during this intro. Before I knew anything about the setting, the lore, the characters, their families, their motivations, or their next door neighbors, I got the old chicken skin. That's how potent this intro is. Part of it is the animation, and we'll talk more about that later, but it's more so the fact that it respects the #1 guideline of visual storytelling: show, don't tell. 0 words, max emotion. Within the span of 2 minutes, you understand that there was a war going on, that there were casualties on both sides, that this kid lost her mom, that this side lost, that the victors live on the other side of the bridge, that war is hell, and it would have taken a full page of words to explain all that and would have put you to sleep drooling on the carpet. Seeing it is what makes you care. And the quality with which they animated these characters emoting, coupled with the effective music, it sells the whole experience while also telling you just enough to get you started on the journey. This is how you present information in a visual medium. You show it, because it's visual. Obviously. Let me touch on vibe and name a couple other IPs that Arcane resembles, because comparisons to other media, while reductive, are way more effective at selling you on things than long-winded reviews are. Arcane goes for this quasi-Victorian steampunk setting with a sheen of magic on top that becomes more and more pervasive the more the show progresses. It's like a full serving of Dishonored with a dash of Bioshock Infinite and a side dish of Full Metal Alchemist. So for all you weebs out there, if you liked Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, then you'll probably like this too. And this series reminds me so much of Dishonored. The settings, the aesthetic, the technology, the divide between the impoverished and the social elite, the supernatural elements, the theme of vengeance, the rough politics, and the ruthless nature of their respective cities, they just share so much DNA. Even some of the music and sound effects sound a lot like what you hear in Dishonored. And if you have seen Arcane and are itching for more, play Dishonored. It should deliver on at least part of the fantasy that the show peddles. More than a fucking MOBA can anyway. So Arcane mostly takes place in this one city that's split between the rich high society and the destitute underworld, populated by a variety of colorful people, some of them sexually confused wimpy men and muscle-bound women that all listen to Imagine Dragons for some reason. There, I pretty much got all the cons out of the way in one phrase. On the plus side, the city looks great, the characters are well conceived and designed, the score is effective, and the animation looks like one continuous visual orgy of 2D and 3D animated goodness. I'm not big on graphics, but there's some really fucking creative visual artistry here. If you're a fairly visual person, and I know some of you are, then this show is a no-brainer just for the visuals alone, as it feeds the visually aroused artistic little cunt inside you. It's got away with superimposed shots, i.e. syncing up the climax of one scene with that of another, like one fight with another fight with a violin concerto on top of a man dying, synchronized with the climax of a sex scene, bathed in colorful graphics with a dash of slow-mo in a display so over the top that it's probably as close as Western animation gets to full-blown anime. Or perhaps this is what anime would like to be had it the budget of 10 film studios. Heresy, I know, comparing one with the other. Just a thought, go ahead and add me in the comments. Either way, pop some LSD, down a few Red Bulls, and enjoy the light show. I don't know how they accomplished the animation exactly, but it looks like a combination of mocap and some careful, painstaking handiwork on top of it. I'm actually curious if they used any motion capture at all, because a lot of these animations look quite analogous to how a real person would move and emote. The action is frantic and deliciously over the top while never losing its punch. Punch intended, I mean pun intended. The camera shakes just enough to sell each bit of impact, while the choreography holds up better than expected upon close scrutiny. Our protagonist is one Vi, probably short for mostly viable protagonist and top contender for the most uninspired name ever given to a character, basically a femshep on TRT. And I rather hoped we had gotten over the pink-haired, masculinized, quasi-female protagonist by now, but apparently The Last of Us 2 is still in style. But I suppose one shouldn't give too much of a fuck. It's got James Rayner in it, and that's good enough for me. Actually, that's one of the main advantages Arcane has, because much like most of your favorite series, it has more than one protagonist. In fact, it boasts quite a big and diverse ensemble cast, so you're bound to find at least one character you'll fancy, and the show does a good job of fleshing each of them out without slowing things down too much because it gives you just enough info and flashbacks to arouse interest and keep you going, without devoting an entire half episode to show you prison guard number 14's entire fucking childhood. It's an effective way to give your viewers a reason to care about the characters. Give them some of their backstories hopefully shown more than told, establish their inner drive and conflict, and pay it off later in the story. This is really basic stuff here, but that's also why it's effective, because the more you complicate it, the more you risk losing the audience along the way. And keep it simple, stupid seems to have been something the studio tattooed on their foreheads, because both the pacing and the amount of exposition on offer are tighter than a caterpillar's wedding dress, and the story tries to get itself told through visuals as much as possible. I mean, the in-universe term for magic is magic. Can't get any simpler than that.
Perhaps it's time for the era of magic.
Hextech. For the era of Hextech.
Never mind. At any rate, simple is probably the way to go when you're dealing with a show adapted from a game, plagiarizing another game inspired by the custom map of a totally unrelated game that most LoL players probably never heard of and never will. Incidentally, James Raynor is a character in said original game, making the reference I made earlier doubly poignant. I'm so smart I can barely fit all this brain into my stupid purple cap. Ha ha ha. Anyway, if the first rule of storytelling is show, don't tell, then the second one probably goes something like don't show everything up front. I was 3 episodes into this thing when I realized that I still had little to no clue what the fuck this was all about, yet I was engaged nonetheless because the game show had spoon-fed me just enough flashbacks and cryptic references to the past and the lore that I still wanted to see what all the fuss was about. The characters are mostly three-dimensional, and some of the villains can be quite persuasive while some of the heroes can make quite a few mistakes in their quest to do good. There's a lot to like. There's lowborn peeps trying to make it to the top, mad scientists trying and mostly failing to make the world a better place, exiles with mommy issues, villains with brother issues, and survivor's guilt, and the sisterly squabble between the two most prominent characters, which are basically female versions of Naruto and Sasuke. And one of them is basically a combination of Gollum and Azula from Avatar, and if that sounds interesting, it's because it kinda is. Most of these characters share one thing, which, as far as I can tell, is the central theme of the show, namely trauma. These are all people that have been traumatized in some way by something in their past, and their motivations stem in large part from that trauma. And this has an interesting effect on the story because it makes their actions both well-intended and often misguided. And it's fun to see all of these different characters clash with one another and develop conflicts of interest throughout the show. There are also some clever callbacks and reversals, like, without giving too much away, in an early scene, this one character contemplates suicide only to be stopped by another character, and then, way later in the show, the exact same situation plays out in reverse, highlighting the contrasting journey these characters have undergone. Now, it does get a bit edgy at times when it occasionally devolves into self-pity, self-righteous talk of sticking it to the man, and spontaneous bouts of crying yielding enough water for my evening bath, but then again, these are severely traumatized teens we're dealing with, so a fair bit of leeway should be afforded here. As long as we don't get too many lines like what makes you different makes you strong, we're good. Don't get me wrong, this can be true. If you have a special skill, it can make you stand out, get noticed, get a job, build a clientele, build an audience, etc. However, this kind of phrasing can also be an excuse for the odd, impressionable viewer to add yet another quirk that doesn't actually increase their strength at all. And since we're teetering towards the negatives, let's commit and start with the feminist overtones. The show has this bad habit of pumping many of its female characters with steroids while pumping most of its male characters with wimp juice. Most of the women are strong, muscular soldier types, while most of the guys are physically wimpy, and the only one that isn't gets killed off. And at first I thought, one or two is fine. There's the odd Steffi Cohen in real life too. It's rare, but it's a thing. But as the show went on, more and more such characters were introduced to the point where I'm wondering, do these people casually put Tren in their morning coffee, or are they all descendants of Arnold Schwarzenegger's left bicep? And in keeping with the theme, Arcane fetishizes violence just a little bit, at least when it comes to its female characters. It makes the modern-day Lara Croft mistake of thinking that the more banged up the female protagonist is, the cooler she gets. Listen, guys do well with scruff. Girls, not so much. That's not to say you can't have your cake and eat it, but there's only so much scruffy mud pie I can stomach before my liver turns into a clay vase. Also, while I praise the visuals for like 3 paragraphs straight, they do go too far at times. Sometimes you get these over-the-top collages that seem like they were directed by the R. Akatsuki subreddit. But by far the most jarring thing for me is the soundtrack. I used to think that putting super hip modern tracks in your period piece was a good idea, back when I was, 6. But one of us grew since then, Arcane, and I rather wish it was you, not me. Whenever 2 characters get into a fight and Imagine Dragons starts playing in the background, it instantly takes me out of the experience. It's like my roommate just finished his homework and decided to unwind by streaming his entire Spotify playlist on full blast from my computer. There's something about retrofitting a steampunk setting with an ultra-modern soundtrack that just doesn't work. I think it has to do with contrast, or lack thereof. Let me explain. If you take, say, a quasi-fantasy setting and slap some hyper-compressed synths and distorted guitars on top of it, it can work surprisingly well. It brings out the raw, almost feral nature of the setting into the foreground, which is why something like Naruto's soundtrack works so well. Or even something like those hand-drawn interludes from Diablo 3, which, while not my thing, they do work for the same reason. Actually, fuck that. Think Dragon Age. The original one, anyway. Its promotional material was chock full of hard rock and 30 Seconds to Mars, and all it did was bring out some of the color in the dark fantasy setting and crank your testosterone levels to 11. Similarly, if you have a modern setting with a post-romantic inspired score, that works too, as evidenced by every fucking Hollywood film out there. But when you have something middle of the road-ish like steampunk, it doesn't work as well because the contrast isn't as strong. We have a semi-technological society with a fully technological soundtrack. Whenever they play a more retro-sounding track on one of those vinyl thingies, it fits very well. But as soon as they go back to doing Skrillex versus Imagine Dragons at Lollapalooza, it kind of breaks the immersion. Music is important, okay? And lastly, this isn't really a con, but if I'm being honest, the season finale kind of left me a tad confused. This is just barely a little bit spoilery, so skip ahead if you like. But it seemed for the longest time like the show was advocating a more tempered approach to politics and diplomacy. There are countless warnings against pandering to and over-empowering the common folk that go unheeded by the main cast because they come across as callous in the moment but seem to snowball and hold more weight once the protagonist foolishly fuck the fluffy pooch with their good intentions, apparently setting up a both extremes are bad kind of moral to the story. Yet in the end, the warmongers seem to have been right all along. War is the answer. Whip out your bazookas and blast your neighbors out of the stratosphere. And it doesn't help that everything hinged not on the actions of most of the characters, but on one arbitrary action by a random girl whose fate was the product of pure chance. It's like finding out that God is real and then accidentally getting killed by George Carlin's ghost. So I'm not entirely sure what the point of the entire season was. I guess it's the fact that the council could have taken action sooner and done a better job to supply some kind of universal basic income to the absolutely impoverished, thus affecting Jinx's path for the better, blah. Except Jinx was traumatized by the last civil war, not the current one, the one which produced Silco, and the current leadership inherited that more than they caused it, but the sins of the father's stick makes it seem random again and blah. Overthinking aside, I'd say Arcane started off mostly on the right foot, leaving me far less resentful of my friends for twisting my arm to binge it than I thought I'd be. It reminds me of the original Pirates of the Caribbean movie, Curse of the Black Pearl, a film inspired by a fucking amusement ride and a project that on paper stood to become the most cynical of affairs. However, one talented director and two stubbornly committed screenwriters later, we got one of the smartest, most compelling, well-crafted quality films of the decade. And while it's too early to tell if Arcane will get there too, that definitely seems to be the intent, and it ain't doing half bad thus far. It's also got some quotable lines like loneliness is the byproduct of a gifted mind or something like that. I wouldn't know. Going forward, I see two potential dangers with the series. Either it gets too flashy and bombastic for its own good, trying too hard to cause epilepsy with every single colorful frame every time all the time, or it lets its lopsided gay overtones get the better of it, flashing you with its hermaphrodite genitalia one too many times. If you can avoid both those pitfalls, Arcane, we can continue our relationship. Just no foot fetishes, okay?